The wind howled across the Badlands like a wounded coyote, carrying with it the sting of red dust that settled on everything: the weathered storefronts, the horses tied to hitching posts, and the souls of those who called Cedar Ridge home. It was 1887, and the small frontier town sat like a sun-bleached bone in the middle of nowhere, caught between civilization and the wild expanses of the American West. Elizabeth Eliza Whitfield pressed her face against the cracked window pane of her family's modest cabin, watching another dust devil dance across the barren street. At 22, she possessed the kind of beauty that the harsh frontier hadn't yet stolen: honey-colored hair that caught the light like prairie wheat, and green eyes that held both intelligence and a yearning for something beyond the horizon. But beauty, she'd learned, was a currency that depreciated quickly in a place where survival mattered more than sentiment. "Eliza, step away from that window," her mother called weakly from the bed in the corner. Margaret Whitfield had been coughing for 3 months now, each rasp a reminder of their precarious existence. Her father, Samuel, sat hunched over the kitchen table. His hands, once strong from working the now barren farm, trembled as he counted their last few coins. "The doctor needs payment," he muttered, not looking up. "Can't keep giving us credit forever." Eliza's jaw tightened. She'd already sold her grandmother's cameo brooch, the one thing of value they'd brought from Pennsylvania. There was nothing left to sell except the sound of expensive boots on wooden planks drew her attention back to the window. Thomas Hartwell was crossing the street, his black suit immaculate despite the dust, his gold watch chain glinting in the afternoon sun. The town's only banker cut an impressive figure among the cowboys and miners, a man who'd built his fortune on the desperation of others. He was 41, with steel-gray temples and the kind of confidence that came from never having to beg for anything. "He's been asking about you again," her father said quietly, finally meeting her eyes. "At the saloon. Says he's looking for a wife, a respectable woman to run his household." Eliza's stomach turned, but she kept her voice steady. "I know. He's a good man." Margaret wheezed from the bed. "Wealthy, established. You'd never want for anything?" "Never want for anything except love," Eliza thought, but didn't say. Love was a luxury the frontier couldn't afford. She'd seen what love had brought her parents: a failed farm, mounting debts, and her mother's health sacrificed to harsh winters and harder times. 3 days later, Thomas Hartwell came calling. He brought flowers, an extravagance in Cedar Ridge, and sat stiffly in their humble parlor, his presence making everything else look shabbier by comparison. "Miss Whitfield," he began, his voice measured and businesslike. "I'll speak plainly. I need a wife who can bring respectability to my position. You need security for yourself and your family. I can provide that." He laid out his offer like a business contract: a fine house on Main Street, the best doctor for her mother, a position for her father at the bank. All she had to do was say yes. Eliza looked at her mother's hollow cheeks, at her father's worn boots held together with twine. Outside, she could hear the town's children playing. Their laughter carried on the same wind that brought tumbleweeds and broken dreams. "You'd have everything," Thomas continued, leaning forward. "Fine dresses, servants, status, no more worrying about where the next meal comes from." "And what would you have?" Eliza asked, meeting his calculating gaze. "A beautiful, intelligent wife who understands the value of practical arrangements." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm not a romantic man, Miss Whitfield, but I am a generous one." That night, Eliza lay awake listening to her mother's labored breathing and her father's restless turning. She thought of Sarah Morrison, who'd married for love and now took in washing to feed her children while her husband drank away their meager earnings. She thought of the traveling photographer who'd passed through last spring, who'd told her she had the kind of face that belonged in a city, not withering away in the dust. "Safety is better than dreams," she whispered to herself in the darkness, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. The wedding took place 2 weeks later in the town's small church. The building smelled of dust and old wood, with sunlight streaming through windows hazed with years of sandstorms. Eliza wore her mother's wedding dress, taken in at the waist and lengthened with a strip of white cotton. Thomas had offered to buy her a new one from Denver, but she declined. Some small part of her needed to hold on to something real, something that had once been worn with hope instead of resignation. Reverend Davis read from his worn Bible, his voice competing with the wind that rattled the windows. "Do you, Elizabeth Marie Whitfield, take this man?" The words washed over her like the endless dust. She was aware of the townspeople behind them, the merchants who owed Thomas money, the farmers whose mortgages he held, the widows who whispered behind their fans. They all thought she was lucky. The banker's gold would save her from the fate that awaited most women in Cedar Ridge. An early grave or a lifetime of back-breaking labor. "I do," she heard herself say, the words barely a whisper. Thomas slipped the gold band onto her finger, heavy, ornate, catching the amber light that filtered through the dusty air. The metal was warm from his pocket, but it felt cold against her skin. As they walked down the aisle as man and wife, Eliza caught a glimpse through the church's open door. In the distance, a lone rider crested the hill, silhouetted against the burning sky. For a moment, her heart lifted with an inexplicable longing. Then Thomas's hand tightened on her arm, and she turned away. That evening, in Thomas's grand house, her house now, Eliza stood before the mirror in her new bedroom. The woman looking back at her wore silk instead of cotton, gold instead of tin. Behind her reflection, she could see the four-poster bed, the Persian rug, the oil paintings of places she'd never see. "She chose the banker's gold," she whispered to her reflection, the words echoing in the empty room like a prophecy or a curse. Outside her window, the sun bled red across the desert, and somewhere in that vast expanse, freedom rode on horseback while she remained behind gilt-edged bars. The gold ring caught the dying light, beautiful and binding. Eliza closed her eyes and tried not to think about what she'd traded for its weight on her finger. In the distance, a coyote howled, wild and free, and she pressed her hand against the window glass, still warm from the day's heat, already missing what she'd never really had. The wedding night passed in stilted conversation and separate beds. Thomas had kissed her forehead, a brief, dry touch, before retiring to his study with a ledger and a bottle of brandy. "I have accounts to review," he'd said, as if their marriage was simply another transaction to be recorded in his books. Eliza had lain awake in the vast bed, listening to the grandfather clock in the hallway mark each hollow hour until dawn painted the sky the color of old bone. 3 months into her new life, Eliza had learned the rhythms of the Hartwell house. Breakfast at 7 sharp. Thomas already buried behind his newspaper, discussing interest rates and foreclosures as casually as the weather. Afternoon spent in the parlor, embroidering cushions that didn't need embroidering, while outside the window, life continued without her. Dinners were formal affairs, even when they dined alone. The long mahogany table between them like a polished river neither could cross. "The Jameson Ranch will be up for auction next week," Thomas announced one evening, cutting his beef with precise movements. "Drought got them. Couldn't make their payment." Eliza set down her fork. "They have 4 children. They should have thought of that before taking a loan they couldn't repay." He reached for his wine, the crystal catching the lamplight. "Sentiment has no place in business, my dear." She'd met Mary Jameson at the general store just yesterday. The woman's eyes had been red-rimmed, her youngest clinging to her faded skirts. Eliza had wanted to slip her some money, but Thomas reviewed every household expense, every penny accounted for in his meticulous records. From her bedroom window, Eliza watched the wagon trains pass through Cedar Ridge, heading west toward California or Oregon, families with hope still bright in their eyes, believing in something beyond the horizon. Sometimes she saw the riders too, men who belonged to no town, no bank, no ledger. They moved like smoke through the streets, there and gone before the dust settled, free as the hawks that circled overhead. The house itself was a monument to Thomas's success. Imported wallpaper from San Francisco, carpets from Turkey, a piano from Boston that no one played. Each room was perfectly appointed and utterly lifeless, like a museum or a tomb. The servants moved through it like ghosts. Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper who rarely smiled. James, the stable hand who kept his eyes downcast. Young Bessie, who dusted the same spotless surfaces every day. "You're living like a queen," her mother had said during one of Eliza's visits. Margaret's cough had improved with the medicine Thomas's money provided, but her eyes held a concern that no amount of wealth could cure. "Aren't you happy?" Of course. Eliza had lied, adjusting the pearl necklace that felt more like a collar with each passing day. How could I not be? But happiness, she was learning, couldn't be purchased like grain at the general store. It couldn't be deposited in a bank or locked in a safe. At night, she dreamed of running, her feet bare in the desert sand, her hair loose and wild, chasing something she couldn't name but knew she needed. The true nature of Thomas's business revealed itself gradually, like a photograph developing in harsh chemicals. She heard the conversations through his study door, the hard edge in his voice when he spoke to desperate men. "Business is business," he'd say. "If you can't pay, you can't stay." One afternoon, a widow named Catherine Walsh came to the house, her 2 children waiting in a worn wagon outside. She begged Thomas for an extension on her loan. "Just until the harvest." Eliza watched from the staircase as her husband shuffled papers, unmoved by the woman's tears. "The contract is clear. Mrs. Walsh, payment was due last week. Please, Mr. Hartwell, my husband died working that land. It's all my boys have left of their father." "Then perhaps you should have considered that before falling behind." He stood, signaling the conversation's end. "You have until Monday to vacate." That night at dinner, Eliza couldn't touch her food. She lost her husband, she said quietly. "Where will they go?" Thomas continued eating, unperturbed. "That's not my concern. I'm running a bank, not a charity." "But you could afford to—" His fork clattered against his plate. "I could afford many things. Elizabeth, that doesn't mean I should do them. You do well to remember that everything in this house, every dress you wear, every morsel you eat, comes from my ability to make hard decisions." The silence that followed was heavier than the summer heat. Eliza looked around the dining room, at the china from England, the silver candlesticks, the oil painting of a European countryside neither of them had seen, and felt like she couldn't breathe. As autumn approached, the disconnect between her gilded cage and the struggling town grew starker. From her window, she watched families packing their belongings, driven out by drought, debt, or Thomas's foreclosures. The general store's shelves grew barer. The school closed when the teacher couldn't afford to stay, but Thomas's wealth only grew, fed by the misfortune of others like a vulture feeding on carrion. He began to control more than just her finances. "The Morrison woman is a bad influence," he declared after Eliza had the tea with Sarah. "All that talk of women's suffrage and independence, you're not to see her again. She's my friend. You're Mrs. Thomas Hartwell now. You don't need friends like that." His tone was final, the same voice he used to foreclose on farms. Gradually, her world shrank to the confines of the house and the small patch of garden in the back. Even there, she felt watched. Thomas had opinions on everything: which flowers were appropriate, how much time she should spend outside, whom she could speak to at church. One evening, a commotion in the street drew her to the window. A group of riders had come to town, dust-covered and wild-looking, their horses dancing with restless energy. Unlike the usual cowboys who frequented Cedar Ridge, these men had an air of defiance about them, as if they answered to no one but the wind itself. "Troublemakers," Thomas muttered, joining her at the window. "Sheriff Watson will run them out by morning." But Eliza couldn't look away. One rider in particular caught her eye, tall and lean, with dark hair that fell past his collar and a way of sitting his horse that suggested he'd been born to it. When he turned toward their house, she glimpsed his face in the lamplight from the saloon, and something stirred in her chest, a recognition of kindred wildness, perhaps, or simply the acknowledgement of what freedom looked like when it rode past your prison window. "Come away from there," Thomas commanded, pulling the heavy curtains closed. It's not proper for you to gawk at such men. That night, Eliza lay in her bed listening to the sounds from the saloon. Laughter, music, the clink of glasses. Life happening somewhere else. Always somewhere else. She thought of the rider, wondering what it would be like to mount a horse and ride until the town was just a speck in the distance. Until Thomas's rules and ledgers couldn't reach her. The gold ring on her finger caught the moonlight. Heavy as ever. She'd chosen this, she reminded herself. Chosen security over uncertainty, walls over wind. But as autumn turned the desert cold and another family loaded their wagon to leave Cedar Ridge, Eliza began to understand that some prisons didn't need bars, just the weight of gold and the absence of choices. The November sky hung low and bruised purple when Eliza saddled her mare, Buttercup, for the journey to the desert postal station. Thomas had reluctantly agreed to let her make the monthly trip to send letters to her cousins in Pennsylvania, one of the few freedoms she'd managed to preserve. "Take James with you," he'd ordered, but the stable hand had fallen ill, and Eliza hadn't mentioned it. She needed these hours alone like she needed air. The postal station sat 15 miles outside Cedar Ridge, a lonely adobe structure where the mail coach stopped twice a week. The route took her through the Badlands, past red rock formations that looked like ancient cathedrals and Joshua trees twisted into prayers by the wind. Here, away from Thomas's watching eyes and the suffocating propriety of town, Eliza could almost remember who she'd been before the gold ring claimed her finger. She was 3 miles from the station when the wall of dust appeared on the horizon. At first, she thought it was another dust devil, common enough in the afternoon heat. But this wall grew taller, wider, moving with the terrible purpose of a living thing. The sky darkened to an ominous ochre, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with menace. Buttercup whinnied nervously, her ears flat against her head. Eliza had lived through sandstorms before, but never alone, never this far from shelter. The wind hit them like a physical force, driving sand that stung like 1,000 needles. Within moments, she couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. The mare panicked, rearing and twisting, and Eliza felt the reins tear from her gloved hands. She hit the ground hard, sand immediately filling her mouth and nose. When she struggled to her feet, Buttercup had vanished into the roiling dust, leaving her alone in a world reduced to stinging chaos. She stumbled forward, one arm shielding her face, the other reaching out blindly. Direction became meaningless. The sun disappeared behind the dust wall, plunging everything into an eerie twilight. Her eyes burned and teared. The moisture immediately caked with grit. Each breath was a struggle against the sand trying to invade her lungs. Time lost meaning in the storm. She could have been walking for minutes or hours. Her dress tore on unseen cacti. Her carefully pinned hair came loose, whipping around her face like angry snakes. The elegant riding boots Thomas had bought her filled with sand, each step becoming torture. Just when she thought she'd collapse, when her legs trembled with exhaustion and her throat felt like she'd swallowed the desert itself, a hand grabbed her arm. Through the chaos, she glimpsed a dark figure, tall and solid against the wind. Without a word, he pulled her against him, wrapping what felt like a blanket or cloak around them both, and began leading her through the storm. They moved together like this, stranger and lost woman, until the rock face of a cliff loomed out of the dust. He guided her into a shallow cave, really more of a deep overhang. But it was enough. The moment they crossed into its shelter, the wind's roar diminished to a distant howl. Eliza collapsed against the rock wall. Coughing and spitting sand, her rescuer moved deeper into the cave, and she heard the strike of a match. Light bloomed from a small fire he'd coaxed from dry brush and driftwood stored there, clearly. This wasn't his first time sheltering in this spot. As her eyes adjusted and the dust settled from their clothes, she finally saw him clearly. He was perhaps 30, with sun-darkened skin and black hair that fell past his collar. His face was angular, marked by wind and weather, with deep brown eyes that held a wildness she'd only glimpsed in hawks and coyotes. He wore the clothes of a vaquero, leather chaps, a dust-covered serape. boots that had seen 1,000 miles. "Rafael Delgado," he said, his voice carrying a slight Spanish accent. "You picked a bad day for riding, Señora." Mrs. Hartwell," she corrected, the title strange on her tongue. "Elizabeth Hartwell." Something flickered in his eyes at the name. The banker's wife. It wasn't a question. Even out here. Thomas's reach extended like a shadow. Raphael handed her a canteen. The water was warm but clean. The best thing she'd ever tasted. As she drank, he tended the fire, his movements economical and graceful. Everything about him spoke of a life lived under open skies, answerable to no one but himself. "The storm will pass by nightfall," he said, settling across from her. The cave was small enough that the fire's warmth reached every corner, creating an intimate circle of light while the storm raged beyond. "Your horse, she'll find her way back. Horses are smarter than people that way. You know these lands well." It wasn't a question either. "They're my home." He pulled out a strip of dried meat from his saddlebag, offering her half, more home than any town could be. As they ate, the storm's fury gradually abated, but darkness was already falling. Travel would be impossible until dawn. Eliza knew she should feel afraid, alone with a strange man. Night approaching, but instead, she felt more alive than she had in months. The cave felt real in a way Thomas's mansion never did. "Why were you out here?" she asked. "I go where the wind takes me." He smiled, and it transformed his weathered face. "Today, it seems, it brought me to you." They talked as the fire crackled between them. He told her about the desert, where to find water, which plants could heal and which could kill, how to read the sky for weather. She found herself telling him about Pennsylvania, about green hills and rain that fell gentle instead of angry. Neither mentioned her husband or her life in town. "You miss it," he observed. "The green. I miss—" She paused, searching for words. "I miss feeling like the world is bigger than 4 walls and account books. The world is as big as you let it be." His eyes held hers across the fire. Walls are only walls if you don't walk through them. As the night deepened, the temperature dropped. Raphael fed the fire and moved closer, offering his serape. She should have refused. Propriety demanded it. But propriety had no place in a cave while a sandstorm dying outside. The wool smelled of smoke and horse and freedom. "Tell me about the life out here," she said. "The real life, not what the townspeople say." His face grew serious. "It's hard. Lonely sometimes. But when you wake with the sun and sleep under stars, when you answer to no one but yourself, there's no gold that could buy that feeling." "Even banker's gold?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. "Especially banker's gold." His voice carried an edge now. "I've seen what that gold costs. Families driven from their lands. Men broken by debt they never understood. Your husband—" He stopped, shaking his head. "Forgive me. It's not your fault. Isn't it?" She looked at her hands, at the ring that caught the firelight. "I chose this. I chose him. We all make choices to survive." His voice gentled. "The desert teaches you that, but surviving isn't living. Señora, even the cactus blooms when the rain comes." The fire burned lower. Outside, the wind had died to a whisper, in the cave's intimate darkness, with this stranger who somehow didn't feel strange. Eliza felt the careful walls she'd built beginning to crack. When Raphael spoke of freedom, she could taste it. When he moved, adjusting the fire, she was aware of every gesture, every breath. "You should sleep," he said finally. "Dawn comes early in the desert." He gave her the serape and moved to the cave's entrance, keeping watch. Eliza curled near the dying fire, but sleep wouldn't come. Her mind raced with thoughts she shouldn't have, feelings she'd buried under propriety and resignation. This man, this desert rider who owned nothing but his horse and gun, had shown her more kindness in one night than Thomas had in months of marriage. When dawn finally painted the desert in shades of rose and gold, Raphael was already saddling his horse, a black stallion that had weathered the storm in some nearby shelter he knew. "I'll take you back," he said, helping her mount behind him. The ride to Cedar Ridge passed too quickly. With her arms around his waist, the desert flying by, Eliza felt like she was riding toward prison and away from possibility. When the town appeared on the horizon, her heart sank. He stopped just outside the town limits, where the desert met civilization. "This is as far as I go," he said, helping her down. "Your mare returned home. They'll be looking for you." She stood there, disheveled and dust-covered, not wanting this to end. "Thank you," she said, the words inadequate for what he'd given her, not just rescue from the storm, but a glimpse of what life could be. He touched his hat, a gesture of farewell. Then, as if reading her thoughts, he said quietly, "The desert is always here, Senora. It waits for those brave enough to claim it." Before she could respond, he wheeled his horse around and was gone, riding hard toward the mountains. Eliza watched until he was just a speck against the morning sky, then squared her shoulders and walked back to town, to Thomas, to her cage. But something had changed in that cave, in that night of storm and firelight. The seed of wildness he'd awakened in her had taken root, and she knew with certainty that this wasn't the last time she'd see Rafael Delgado. The desert had claimed a piece of her heart, and like he said, it would wait. The firelight painted shadows on the cave walls, dancing like ancient spirits while the dying wind whispered secrets through the rock. Eliza sat closer to Rafael now, the proper distance between them forgotten as the desert night wrapped around them like a confession. The serape covered them both, creating a world within a world, separate from everything beyond the cave's embrace. "You're shivering," Rafael said softly, his voice barely above the crackling flames. She was, but not from cold. Being near him awakened something primal in her, something that had nothing to do with the refined manners of Thomas's world. When Rafael shifted to add more wood to the fire, his hand brushed hers, and the touch sent lightning through her veins. "Tell me," she whispered, surprising herself with her boldness. "What is it like to belong to no one but yourself?" His eyes found hers across the flickering light. "It's like breathing after nearly drowning, like seeing color after years of gray." He paused, studying her face. "But you know this feeling, don't you? I see it in your eyes, the wildness trying to escape." "I chose my cage," the words came out bitter. "For safety, for family, for all the reasonable reasons that make perfect sense in daylight. And in darkness? In darkness, I dream of running." The fire crackled between them, sending sparks spiraling upward. Outside, the storm had gentled to a whisper, but neither made any move to leave their shelter. The cave had become a sanctuary, a place outside of time where bankers' wives and desert riders could speak truths too dangerous for the world beyond. Rafael moved then, slow and deliberate, closing the distance between them. "Elena," he said, and she realized he'd translated her name to Spanish, making it sound like music. "Some cages we choose, others are chosen for us. But every cage has a door, if we're brave enough to open it." She should have pulled away when his hand touched her cheek, rough fingers gentle against her skin. Should have remembered her vows, her duty, the gold ring that marked her as another man's property. Instead, she leaned into his touch, her eyes closing as tears she'd held back for months finally fell. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "Afraid of wanting what I can't have, afraid of feeling alive when I'm supposed to be grateful for being numb. Fear is the beginning of wisdom," he murmured, his thumb brushing away her tears. "But letting fear rule you, that's the beginning of death." When she opened her eyes, his face was close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could count the lines the sun had etched at their corners. He smelled of leather and sage, of wide-open spaces and possibilities. Everything Thomas was not. Everything her life was not. Everything she'd convinced herself she didn't need. "This is madness," she whispered, even as she swayed toward him. "The best things usually are." The kiss was inevitable as sunrise, soft at first, almost hesitant. Then Eliza's hands found their way into his hair, and his arms pulled her against him, and the kiss deepened into something desperate and necessary. It tasted of sand and freedom, of choices made in darkness that daylight couldn't undo. They pulled apart, breathing hard, staring at each other with a mixture of wonder and terror. The fire had burned lower, casting them in a softer light that made everything seem like a dream. "Raphael," she began, but he pressed a finger to her lips. "No apologies, no regrets, not tonight." And so they sat together, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist, watching the fire die to embers. He told her stories of the desert, of hidden oases where wild horses drank, of ancient caves with paintings from peoples long vanished, of nights so clear you could see the edge of forever. She told him about her dreams, the ones she'd never spoken aloud, of painting, of writing, of seeing the ocean she'd only read about in books. "Why do you ride alone?" she asked as the night deepened. "Surely there's danger." His body tensed slightly. "There are those who believe the land belongs only to men with papers and deeds. My people were here before the borders, before the banks. We rode these trails when Cedar Ridge was just dust and dreams." His voice carried an edge of old anger. "Now they call us outlaws for living as we always have." Understanding dawned. "The riders who come to town, the ones Thomas calls troublemakers, we take nothing that wasn't stolen first. When a banker forecloses on a widow's home, when cattle barons fence off water that's been free for generations." He shrugged. "Justice wears many faces in the desert." She should have been scandalized, should have pulled away. Instead, she found herself thinking of Catherine Walsh, of all the families Thomas had driven from their homes. "He says it's just business. Everything is just business to men like him, even wives." The truth of it stung, but she couldn't deny it. "Then what am I to you?" He turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "You are the sunrise after a long night. You are water in the desert. You are—" He stopped, shaking his head. "You are married to another man. A man who sees me as another possession, like his horses or his house. That doesn't change what is." But even as he said it, his hand found hers, their fingers intertwining like their lives could somehow braid together against all reason. They stayed like that as the storm finally died completely, leaving only the vast silence of the desert night, when the embers were just aglow and the cave had grown cold. They lay down side by side, not touching except for their joined hands. Eliza had never felt anything as intimate as this, fully clothed, a careful distance between their bodies, yet connected by something deeper than propriety could sever. "What happens when the sun rises?" she asked the darkness. "You go back to your life, I go back to mine, and if I can't, if this night has ruined me for cages and account books and proper dinners with improper men," he squeezed her hand, "then you'll know where to find me. The desert keeps its promises, Elena, and so do I." She turned to study his profile in the dim light. "Where?" "There's a place where 3 mesas meet. 2 days' ride north, a spring hidden in the rocks, cottonwoods for shade. I camp there when the moon is new." He smiled slightly. "Just to watch the stars, you understand, not to wait for anyone." "Of course not," she whispered, memorizing every word. "And I would never ride there. It wouldn't be proper. Terribly improper." They both knew they were lying, making promises in the language of denial. But some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud, even in a cave at the edge of the world. As dawn approached, painting the sky outside in pale pastels, they rose and prepared to leave their sanctuary. Raphael helped her pin up her hair, his fingers gentle but clumsy with the unfamiliar task. She straightened his serape, brushing away sand that had already become part of the fabric. At the cave's entrance, they paused. The world beyond looked different somehow, sharper, more vivid, as if the storm had washed away a film she hadn't known was there. "That night claimed my heart," she said quietly, not looking at him. "You know that, don't you? Whatever happens next, this night has claimed me." He cupped her face in his hands, kissing her once more, soft, fierce, final. "Then we are both ruined, mi amor, and both saved." They didn't speak on the ride back to town. Her arms around his waist, her cheek pressed against his back. Eliza tried to memorize everything, the feel of him, the rhythm of the horse's gait, the way the morning light turned the desert to gold. She knew that after this, every night in her feather bed would be haunted by the memory of a cave floor and a stranger's hand in hers. When he left her at the town's edge and rode away, she didn't watch him go. She couldn't. Instead, she walked toward her gilded cage with her head high, carrying the desert in her heart, the taste of freedom on her lips, and the knowledge that 3 mesas waited in the north, keeping promises under a new moon sky. The storm had passed, but Eliza carried its wildness inside her. She moved through the Hartwell house like a sleepwalker, her body present while her spirit remained in a cave with firelight and promises. Thomas noticed nothing at first, absorbed in his ledgers and foreclosures. But as days turned to weeks, even he could not ignore the change. "You've been distracted lately," he observed one evening over dinner, his gray eyes studying her with the same calculating look he gave to questionable investments. "Are you ill?" "Perhaps it's the heat," she replied, pushing food around her plate. Everything tasted like sand since that night. "It's December. Elizabeth." She looked up, startled. Had so much time passed? The days blurred together in the house, each one identical to the last. Only her dreams had clarity now. Dreams of black horses and brown eyes, of 3 mesas waiting under a moonless sky. Thomas set down his fork with deliberate precision. "Mrs. Henderson mentioned you've been spending time at the window again, watching the street. Is it a crime to look outside?" "It is when you're looking for something, or someone." His voice carried a new edge, sharp as the wind that cut through the desert. "I'm not a fool. Elizabeth, you returned from that storm. Different." Her heart hammered, but she kept her voice steady. "The storm frightened me. Perhaps I'm still recovering." He leaned back, fingers steepled. "Sheriff Watson tells me there have been more troubles lately. Those Mexican riders growing bolder. They robbed the stage last week, gave the money to families I'd rightfully foreclosed on." His laugh was bitter. "As if they're some kind of heroes." Eliza's hands clenched in her lap. She could see Raphael's face in the firelight, hear his voice. "Justice wears many faces in the desert. Heroes or criminals." Thomas continued. "Depends which side of the law you stand on. And we, my dear, stand firmly on the side of civilization, order, progress." He paused meaningfully. "I trust you understand that." That night, Eliza lay awake counting the days until the new moon. 5 more nights. She pressed her face into the pillow, trying to summon the scent of sage and leather, but all she smelled was lavender soap and propriety. The next morning brought troubling news. Thomas burst into the breakfast room, newspaper clenched in his fist. "They've done it now," he snarled. "Those desert rats attacked the Copper Crown Mines payroll wagon. Killed 2 guards. Eliza's blood ran cold. "Killed?" "The guards fired first, according to witnesses. But dead is dead." He threw the paper on the table. "Governor's putting a bounty on their heads. $500 for their leader. They say he rides a black stallion. Goes by Raphael." The room spun. Eliza gripped the table edge, her knuckles white. Thomas's eyes narrowed. "You've gone pale." "The violence," she managed. "It's shocking. It's necessary. These men threaten everything we've built here. The railroad won't come to a lawless town. Investors need security." He stood, adjusting his coat. "I'm meeting with the sheriff and the other leading citizens. We're forming a committee, hiring additional guns. This ends now." After he left, Eliza read the newspaper with trembling hands. The description of the raiders' leader was vague but damning. Tall, dark-haired, rides like he was born on horseback. It could be any number of men, but she knew. That afternoon, she overheard Thomas in his study with Sheriff Watson. Double the patrols near Skeleton Canyon and the northern passes. That's where they hide. The northern passes cover a lot of ground. Mr. Hartwell. Then focus on water sources. Even outlaws need to drink. There's a spring where 3 mesas meet. Old Apache camping ground. Postmen there. Eliza's heart stopped. Their place. He was talking about their place. She waited until the house settled into sleep. then crept to Thomas's study. His desk was locked, but she knew where he hid the key. Behind a portrait of his father, another hard man who'd built his fortune on others' misfortunes. Inside the drawer, she found what she feared: detailed maps marking water sources, patrol schedules, plans for an ambush. The new moon was 3 nights away. The next day, she pleaded illness and kept to her room, pacing like a caged animal. She had to warn Raphael, but how? Thomas had eyes everywhere. Mrs. Henderson reported her every movement. Even her mare had been declared too spirited and sold, replaced with a docile gelding that wouldn't carry her far. By evening, desperation drove her to the kitchen where Bessie was preparing dinner. The girl had always been kind, and more importantly, her brother Miguel worked at the livery stable. "Bessie," Eliza said quietly, "I need your help." The girl's eyes widened with fear. "Ma'am, I can't. Mr. Hartwell said, please." Eliza pulled off her wedding ring, pressing it into Bessie's palm. "Take this. It's worth more than you make in 5 years. All I need is for your brother to saddle a fast horse and leave it behind the old mission tomorrow night. No questions." Bessie stared at the ring, then at Eliza's desperate face. Slowly, she nodded. The next night, Eliza waited until Thomas retired, then slipped from the house wrapped in a dark cloak. The streets were empty. Everyone huddled inside against the December cold. The old mission stood at the town's edge, abandoned since the last priest died of fever. Miguel was as good as his sister's word. A sturdy Mustang waited in the shadows, saddled and ready. Eliza mounted and rode hard into the darkness, toward the northern mountains, toward 3 mesas and a promise. The journey that had taken 2 days with Raphael took her longer alone. She stopped only when the horse needed rest, pushing through exhaustion and fear. The landscape looked different in winter, starker, more unforgiving. Twice she thought she was lost, but then she'd see a landmark Raphael had pointed out, and her heart would steady. She reached the hidden spring as the sun peeked overhead on the second day. The cottonwoods were bare now, their branches reaching toward the sky like prayers. There was no sign of Raphael, no evidence anyone had camped here recently. Eliza watered the horse and settled down to wait, wrapped in blankets she'd tied to the saddle. As afternoon faded to evening, doubt crept in. What if he didn't come? What if the patrols had already found him? What if— The sound of hooves on stone made her scramble to her feet. A lone rider approached, moving carefully through the rocks. When he emerged into the clearing, Eliza's knees nearly buckled with relief. Raphael dismounted in one fluid motion, crossing to her in 3 strides. "Elena, Dios mío, what are you doing here?" "They know about this place," she said urgently. "Thomas knows. There's going to be an ambush." He caught her shoulders, steadying her. "Slow down. Tell me everything." She explained about the committee, the patrols, the mapped water sources. As she spoke, his face grew grimmer. "You risked everything to warn me," he said when she finished. "They said you killed 2 guards. They fired first. We defended ourselves." His jaw clenched. "But dead men can't testify to who shot first. You have to leave. Take your men and go far from here. Mexico, maybe, or California. This is our land." "We don't run, then you'll die." The words tore from her throat. "They have more guns, more men. And the law?" "The law?" He laughed bitterly. "The same law that lets your husband steal homes from widows, that hangs men for being born with brown skin." He shook his head. "No. Elena, if we run now, they win everything." "Please," she whispered, tears flowing freely. "I can't lose you. Not when I've just found you." His expression softened. He pulled her against him, and she breathed him in, sage and leather and home. "You beautiful, brave fool." He murmured into her hair. "You shouldn't have come. I had to, don't you understand? That night in the cave changed everything." He finished. "I know. Why do you think I've stayed away from town? Every night I tell myself to ride south, to forget the banker's wife with a wildfire in her eyes. And every morning I'm still here, waiting for a woman who can never be mine." She pulled back to look at him. "I left my ring with Bessie. I'm done pretending that cage is my home." His eyes widened. "Elena, I know it's madness. I know we have no future, but I can't go back to that house, to that life. I'd rather have one day of freedom with you than a lifetime of safety with him." He crushed her to him then, kissing her with all the desperation of their separation. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "There's going to be a fight," he said quietly. "Blood will spill. Win or lose, things will never be the same. Is that the life you're choosing?" "I'm choosing you," she said simply. "Whatever comes with that choice, I accept." He studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then we'd better make plans. If they know about this place, we need to move camp." "And Elena?" His thumb traced her cheekbone. "No more looking back. From now on, we ride toward whatever sunrise finds us." As they mounted their horses and rode deeper into the mountains, Eliza felt the last chains of her old life break and fall away. Behind them lay Cedar Ridge, Thomas, and the woman who'd chosen Banker's Gold. Ahead stretched uncertainty, danger, and quite possibly death. She had never felt more alive. The news of Eliza's disappearance spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire in drought season. Thomas Hartwell stood in his study, face purple with rage, while Sheriff Watson shifted uncomfortably before him. "Find her," Thomas snarled, slamming his fist on the desk. "Find my wife and bring her back. Mr. Hartwell, if she left of her own accord, she was taken, kidnapped by those Mexican bandits." His voice brooked no argument. No respectable woman would abandon her home voluntarily. Double the bounty on Rafael Delgado. $1,000, dead or alive. The sheriff's eyes widened. "That's a lot of money. I want him to pay for this insult. And when you bring her back..." Thomas's smile was cold as a desert night. "She'll learn what happens to wives who forget their place." Miles away, in a hidden canyon deep in the mountains, Rafael's band had made their new camp. 20 men, hard-bitten and loyal, who'd ridden with him for years. When he'd arrived with Eliza, they'd exchanged glances but said nothing. Rafael's word was law among them. "They're coming," announced Carlos, Rafael's lieutenant, riding hard into camp. 50 men, maybe more, professional guns hired from Tucson. They'll reach the old spring by nightfall. Eliza, dressed now in men's clothing that allowed her to ride freely, felt her stomach clench. She'd been learning to shoot, to ride like the wind, to read the desert signs, but she wasn't ready for this. Rafael studied the horizon, calculating. "Then we give them what they expect to find." He turned to his men. "Jorge, take 5 riders. Leave clear tracks toward Mexico. Let them think we're running." His gaze found Eliza. "The rest of us go north to Eagle's Nest Canyon." "That's a box canyon," protested Diego, an older rider. "If they trap us there..." "They won't," Rafael said with quiet confidence, "because they'll be too busy chasing shadows south." As the men prepared, Rafael drew Eliza aside. "I can send you away. There's a convent in Santa Fe." "No." Her voice was firm. "I made my choice. I stand with you." He cupped her face, thumb tracing her cheekbone. "You know what your husband will do if he catches you." "He won't." She covered his hand with hers. "Because you won't let him." That night, they rode hard through terrain that would have terrified her just weeks ago. Eliza had learned to trust her horse, to move with the animal rather than simply upon it. The men had accepted her, this banker's wife who'd thrown away everything for their leader. She'd tended their wounds, shared their meager meals, proven herself stronger than any of them had expected. They reached Eagle's Nest Canyon as dawn broke. It was a natural fortress. High walls, a hidden spring, only one way in or out, but that single entrance could be defended by a handful of men against an army. "Post lookouts," Rafael ordered. "Everyone else, rest while you can." Eliza found herself beside the spring, washing trail dust from her face. In the water's surface, she barely recognized her reflection. Sun had darkened her skin. Hardship had sharpened her features. But her eyes burned brighter than ever. "Regrets?" Rafael asked. Joining her. None, she said truthfully. For the first time in my life, I'm where I choose to be. The attack came at sunset, not the main force. That was still chasing ghosts toward Mexico, but a smaller group led by Thomas himself. He'd been too smart for the deception, too driven by wounded pride to follow false trails. "Elizabeth," his voice echoed off the canyon walls. "I know you're there. Come out now, and I'll forgive this madness." Eliza moved to the canyon's edge, where she could see without being seen. Thomas sat his horse like a general surveying a battlefield, flanked by hired guns whose faces showed nothing but professional interest. "She's my wife," Thomas continued. "The law is on my side. Send her out, Delgado, and we'll leave. Keep her, and every man with you dies." Raphael appeared on a ledge above, rifle casual in his hands. "She came of her own will. Banker, maybe you should ask yourself why. Because you seduced her, confused her with your savage ways." Thomas's voice dripped contempt. "She belongs to civilization, not rolling in the dirt with animals. I belong to myself," Eliza shouted, stepping into view. A gasp ran through Thomas's men. The elegant banker's wife stood transformed, hair wild, dressed in leather and determination, a pistol at her hip. Thomas's face contorted. "You've shamed yourself, shamed me, but you're still my wife, and you will come home." "Your home was never mine," she called down. "It was just another property in your ledger. Well, I've torn out that page." "Then you've chosen your fate." Thomas raised his hand, and his men lifted their rifles. The canyon erupted. Gunfire echoed like thunder between the walls. Eliza threw herself behind a boulder as bullets whined overhead. She'd practiced shooting at targets, but this was different. The acrid smell of powder, the shouts of men, the terrible reality of violence. Raphael's men held the high ground, picking off attackers with careful shots. But Thomas had brought professionals, men who knew their business. They found cover, returned fire with deadly accuracy. Eliza saw Carlos fall, clutching his shoulder. Without thinking, she ran to him, dragging him to safety as bullets sparked off the rocks around them. His blood was warm on her hands as she pressed cloth to the wound. "Senora," he gasped. "You should not—" "Hush," she said, tying off a bandage with hands that barely shook. "Save your strength." The battle raged as darkness fell. Muzzle flashes lit the canyon like deadly fireflies. Then, suddenly, Thomas's voice rang out again. "Enough. I offer single combat, myself against Delgado. Winner takes the woman and the canyon. Losers' men go free." A hush fell. Eliza's heart hammered. She knew Thomas. He wouldn't make such an offer unless he believed he could win. The man had been a soldier before he was a banker, had killed before he'd learned to foreclose. Raphael appeared from behind his cover. "I accept." "No!" Eliza started forward, but Jorge caught her arm. "It's his choice. Senora. His right." The two men met in the center of the canyon floor. Lit by torches their men held. Thomas had removed his coat, revealing the lean strength beneath. Raphael moved with his usual grace, but Eliza saw the exhaustion in his shoulders, the way he favored his left side where an old wound troubled him. They circled each other, predators sizing up prey. "You could have stayed with your kind," Thomas said. "Instead, you reached above your station. That's always fatal. And you could have been content with your wealth." Raphael replied, "Instead, you had to own everything you touched, even hearts." Thomas lunged, surprisingly fast. His blade, when had he drawn a blade, sliced toward Raphael's throat. The younger man twisted aside, but not quite fast enough. Blood appeared on his neck, black in the torchlight. Eliza bit her knuckle to keep from crying out. Around her, men watched in tense silence. The fight was brutal, without honor or mercy. These weren't gentlemen dueling over honor. They were two men who hated each other, fighting over principles that couldn't coexist. Thomas's military training showed in his calculated attacks. Raphael's life of survival showed in his refusal to fall. Then Thomas made a mistake. Overconfident from drawing blood, he pressed too hard. Raphael flowed aside like water, and suddenly his knife was at Thomas's throat. "Yield!" Raphael panted. Thomas's eyes found Eliza in the crowd. "She'll never be yours," he hissed. "She's marked by my ring, my name. You can kill me, but you can't erase that." "Watch me," Raphael said quietly. But before he could move, gunfire erupted from the canyon rim. The main force had returned, drawn by the sound of battle. In the chaos, Thomas rolled away, shouting orders. "Fall back," Raphael commanded. "Deeper into the canyon." They retreated, returning fire, using every rock and shadow. Eliza found herself beside Raphael, reloading his rifle as he fired, moving as one being. This was partnership forged in fire, love proven in blood. But they were outnumbered 3-1. Step by step, they gave ground, until they reached the box end of the canyon. Behind them, only sheer walls. Before them, Thomas's men advancing like a tide. "I'm sorry," Raphael said quietly, pulling Eliza close. "I should have sent you away." "No," she said fiercely. "Whatever comes, we face it together." Thomas appeared through the gun smoke, triumph written on his bloodied face. "It's over, Delgado. You're trapped like the animal you are." That's when they heard it, hoofbeats like thunder, war cries splitting the night. Over the canyon rim poured riders, dozens of them. Not Raphael's men, these were others, farmers and vaqueros, men who'd lost homes to Thomas's foreclosures, families Raphael had helped. "For justice!" someone shouted, and the canyon became a battlefield. The tide turned in moments. Thomas's hired guns, caught between two forces, began throwing down weapons. Thomas himself stood frozen, watching his certain victory crumble. When the dust settled, he was on his knees, Raphael's knife at his throat again. This time, there would be no escape. "Kill me, then," Thomas spat. "Make her a widow as well as a whore." Raphael looked at Eliza. In her eyes, he saw not bloodlust but something deeper, a desire for true justice, not mere revenge. "No," Raphael said finally. "Death's too easy. You'll live, banker. Live to see everything you built torn down. Your banks investigated, your crimes exposed. These men will testify. Papers will be found. You'll face judges who can't be bought." He smiled coldly. "You'll learn what it's like to lose everything, to be powerless." As Thomas was led away, Eliza felt no triumph, only exhaustion. The price of freedom had been high, men dead, blood spilled, innocence lost forever. But as Raphael's arms closed around her, as the men cheered their unlikely victory, she knew she'd pay it again. "What now?" she asked, looking up at him. "Now?" He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "Now we disappear. Let the law sort out Thomas. We'll find somewhere new, California maybe, or Colorado. Somewhere we can build something together." "Together," she repeated, the word like a prayer. "I like the sound of that." The canyon erupted into chaos. What had been an organized assault dissolved into a melee of gunfire, shouts, and the screams of wounded men. Eliza pressed herself against the rock wall, Raphael shielding her with his body as bullets whined overhead like angry hornets. "The cave!" Raphael shouted over the din, pointing to a narrow opening in the canyon wall. "Get to the cave!" It was the same type of shelter where they'd first found each other, but now it meant survival rather than sanctuary. Eliza grabbed Carlos, who was still bleeding from his shoulder, and half-dragged him towards safety. Around them, the battle raged with primal fury. Thomas's hired guns were professionals, but Raphael's allies fought with the desperation of men who had nothing left to lose. These were people Thomas had crushed beneath his boot heel, farmers, laborers, families torn apart by his greed. Now they had their chance for justice, and they seized it with both hands. Inside the shallow cave, Eliza worked frantically to stop Carlos's bleeding. Her hands, once soft from a life of leisure, now moved with hard-won skill. The metallic scent of blood filled the air, mixing with gunpowder and dust. "Señora," Carlos gasped, "you should not have come back for me." "Quiet," she ordered, tearing strips from her shirt for bandages. "Save your strength." Through the cave mouth, she could see the battle tide turning, Thomas's men, caught in crossfire and outnumbered, began to fall back, but Thomas himself fought on, driven by a rage that transcended reason. She watched him reload his rifle with mechanical precision, his face a mask of cold fury. Raphael appeared at the cave entrance, blood streaming from a gash above his eye. "How many wounded?" "3 here," Eliza reported. "Carlos is the worst." "Can they travel?" Before she could answer, a figure lunged from the shadows, one of Thomas's men who'd circled behind. His knife flashed toward Raphael's back. Without thinking, Eliza drew the pistol from her hip and fired. The man crumpled, his knife clattering on stone. Raphael spun, saw the fallen attacker, then looked at Eliza with something like awe. "You saved my life." "You saved mine first," she said simply, though her hands shook as she holstered the weapon. She'd taken a life, crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Yet faced with the choice between Raphael's life and a stranger's, there had been no choice at all. The gunfire was dying down now, replaced by the groans of wounded men and the harsh breathing of exhaustion. Jorge appeared, his arm in a makeshift sling. "We've won. Jefe, most of them are down or surrendered, but Thomas—" He shook his head. "He's holed up behind those rocks with 5 men. Says he'll kill anyone who approaches." Raphael's jaw tightened. "Then we wait him out. Post guards. See to the wounded." He turned to Eliza. "I need you to—" "No." She stood, checking her ammunition. "Where you go, I go. We settled that." Their eyes met, and in his she saw pride mixed with fear. "Mi amor, you've done enough." "Have I?" She gestured to the cave full of wounded men, the blood on the ground, the bodies scattered across the canyon floor. "This is my fight too. Raphael, my choices led us here as much as yours." Before he could argue, a voice rang out from Thomas's position. "Delgado, I have a proposition." Raphael moved cautiously to where he could see the banker's makeshift fort. "Speak. Let my men go. They're hired guns, nothing more. This is between us. And why would I do that? Because if you don't, I'll kill them myself before I let you take me alive. Their blood will be on your hands." Eliza knew Thomas well enough to know he meant it. In his twisted logic, he'd rather murder his own men than suffer the humiliation of defeat. "Let them go," she called out before Raphael could respond. "Let them go, Thomas, and face us yourself. Or are you too much of a coward without paid men around you?" A long silence. Then, one by one, 5 men emerged from behind the rocks, hands raised. They filed past, careful not to make sudden movements, and disappeared into the night. None looked back. Now Thomas stood alone, still armed, still dangerous. The torchlight threw wild shadows on the canyon walls, making him look like some demon from the old stories. "Satisfied?" he called. "Now what? Do we stand here until dawn? Until one of your men gets lucky with a shot?" "Come out," Raphael said. "Face justice like a man." Thomas's laugh was bitter as desert alkali. "Justice? From a Mexican bandit and a faithless wife? I think not." He moved then, not toward them but up, scrambling up the loose scree toward a higher ledge. Raphael and several men fired, but darkness and movement made him a difficult target. In moments, he'd gained a position where he could rain fire down on anyone who approached. "Damn him," Jorge muttered. He could hold that spot for hours. But Eliza knew Thomas better. His pride wouldn't let him simply defend. He needed to attack, to dominate. Sure enough, she saw him shifting position, looking for a clear shot at Raphael. "The old trail," she said suddenly. "Behind the waterfall. It leads to that ledge." Raphael looked at her sharply. "How do you—" "I explored while you were gone yesterday. The water's low this season. Someone could climb behind it. Come up behind him." "I'll go," Raphael said immediately. "No." Eliza checked her pistol again. "He's expecting you, watching for you, but me—" She smiled grimly. "He still sees me as property to be reclaimed, not a threat to be eliminated." "Absolutely not. There's no time to argue." Already, Thomas was settling into position, rifle trained on their location. Keep him focused here. I'll only get one chance." Before Raphael could stop her, she slipped away into the shadows. The trail was where she remembered, a narrow track carved by centuries of water and wind. The waterfall was barely a trickle this late in the year, but still enough to soak her as she edged behind it. The rock was slick, treacherous. One slip meant a fall that would break bones if not kill outright. But months of hard living had given her strength and balance she'd never possessed in her corseted former life. She climbed steadily, silently, while below Raphael and the others kept Thomas's attention with occasional shots. She emerged on the ledge 50 feet from where Thomas crouched. In the moonlight, she could see his face clearly. The man she'd married, shared a house with, called husband. But whatever human feelings had once existed between them had burned away, leaving only ash and hatred. Moving carefully, she positioned herself behind a boulder. One shot, that's all she'd have before he turned on her. Her hands were steady now, all trembling, burned away by necessity. "Thomas," she called softly. He spun, rifle swinging toward her, and she fired. The bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around. His rifle clattered over the ledge, and suddenly he was just a wounded man on his knees, looking at her with eyes that held shock and something else, perhaps, at last, understanding. "You!" he gasped, pressing a hand to the spreading red stain. "It had to be you." "Yes," she said simply, keeping her pistol trained on him. It did. Raphael and the others were climbing toward them now, but Eliza didn't look away from Thomas. This moment was theirs alone, the end of their particular story. "I gave you everything," he said, blood bubbling on his lips. "You gave me things," she corrected. "But you took my freedom, my choice, my soul, piece by piece. I loved you. You loved owning me. There's a difference." Thomas tried to laugh, but it came out as a cough. "And him? That savage. He owns you now. No one owns me. Not anymore." She finally lowered the pistol. "That's what you never understood. Thomas, love isn't about possession. It's about choosing to stay." Raphael reached them then, immediately moving to secure Thomas's wound. Even now, even after everything, he wouldn't let the man simply bleed out. That was the difference between them. Thomas took life carelessly, while Raphael preserved it when possible. "Why?" Thomas asked, looking up at Raphael with genuine confusion. "Why save me?" "Because I'm not you," Raphael said simply. "And because living with your failures will be worse than any death." As they carried Thomas down from the ledge, Eliza felt the last chains of her old life break completely. She'd been tested in fire and blood, and she'd survived. More than survived. She'd chosen, acted, become someone entirely new. The cave where it all began was now a makeshift hospital. She worked through the night beside Raphael, tending wounds, comforting the dying. By dawn, the toll was clear. 8 dead from their side. 15 from Thomas's hired guns. Too many lives lost for one man's greed and another's freedom. As the sun painted the canyon walls gold and crimson, Eliza stood with Raphael looking out at the new day. Thomas had been taken to town under guard, along with evidence Jorge had hidden, documents proving years of illegal foreclosures, bribes, and worse. The law that had protected him would now destroy him. "It's over," Raphael said quietly. "No," Eliza corrected, taking his hand. "It's just beginning." She was right. The old Eliza had died in that canyon, along with the life she'd been forced to live. But from those ashes, someone new had risen, a woman who could ride and shoot and heal, who could love freely and fight fiercely, who belonged to no one but herself. The desert had claimed her, as Raphael had promised it would, and she had claimed it in return, writing her own story in blood and choice across its ancient stones. Dawn broke crimson over Cedar Ridge, painting the dusty streets in shades of blood and gold. The town that had once bowed to Thomas Hartwell's will now buzzed with the news of his downfall. Federal marshals had arrived from Tucson, drawn by the evidence of corruption that ran deeper than anyone had imagined. Eliza stood on the hill overlooking the town, wearing a simple cotton dress instead of the men's clothing she'd grown accustomed to. Beside her, Raphael cut a striking figure in his finest shirt, still simple, but clean and proud. They'd come to witness the final act of their story, to see justice done at last. "Are you ready for this?" Raphael asked, taking her hand. "I've been ready since the day I said I do to the wrong man," she replied. The courthouse was packed. Farmers, miners, shopkeepers, all the people Thomas had ground beneath his heel, filled every seat and lined the walls. When the banker was brought in, shackled and diminished, a murmur ran through the crowd. His fine clothes were gone, replaced by prison gray. His proud bearing had crumbled, leaving a hollow-eyed man who flinched at shadows. Judge Harrison, sent specially from the territorial capital, was known for his incorruptibility. He reviewed the evidence with methodical care, forged documents, illegal foreclosures, bribery of local officials. One by one, Thomas's victims testified. Catherine Walsh spoke of losing her husband's farm. The Jameson family detailed their eviction in winter. Others told similar stories, a litany of greed and cruelty dressed in legal language. When Eliza was called to testify, the courtroom fell silent. She walked to the witness stand with her head high, aware of every eye upon her. Some held sympathy, others curiosity, a few contempt. She was, after all, the woman who'd left her husband for an outlaw, Mrs. Hartwell. The prosecutor began, then paused. "Do you still use that name?" "No," she said clearly. "I'm Elizabeth Whitfield. I reclaim my father's name and my own identity." Thomas's lawyer objected, but the judge overruled him. "The witness may identify herself as she chooses. Continue." She told her story simply, without embellishment. The marriage for security, the gradual realization of Thomas's cruelty, the night in the storm that opened her eyes to what life could be, her flight and the pursuit that followed. "You left your husband for Rafael Delgado," Thomas's lawyer said on cross-examination, his tone suggesting scandal. "A known outlaw, a thief." "I left a prison for freedom," Eliza corrected. "I left a man who saw me as property for one who saw me as a person. As for thief," she looked directly at Thomas, "the only thief in this courtroom is the man who stole homes from desperate families and called it business." When the verdict came, guilty on all counts, no one was surprised. Thomas would spend 20 years in territorial prison, his assets seized to compensate his victims. As he was led away, he looked back once at Eliza. She met his gaze steadily, without hatred or pity, and he was the first to look away. Outside the courthouse, the crowd dispersed slowly. Some nodded to Eliza, others turned away. She would never be fully accepted here. The scandal would follow her always. But respect, she'd learned, mattered more than acceptance. "Miss Whitfield," a familiar voice called. She turned to find Bessie, the housemaid who'd helped her escape. The girl held out a small package. "I saved this from the house before they seized everything. Thought you might want it." Inside was her mother's wedding photograph, the one thing from her old life worth keeping. Eliza hugged the girl, pressing money into her hand despite protests. As they walked back through town, Sheriff Watson approached. He'd aged years in the past months, the weight of his complicity with Thomas evident in every line of his face. "Delgado," he said gruffly. "Judge says you're cleared. The bounty's lifted, but—" He glanced around and lowered his voice. "Might be best if you moved on. Too much history here." "We plan to," Raphael replied calmly. "Today, in fact." The sheriff nodded and walked away, relief evident in his posture. One more reminder that justice and peace didn't always walk hand in hand. They returned to the camp where Raphael's men waited with packed horses and supplies. Those who'd survived the canyon battle had chosen different paths, some heading to Mexico, others to California, a few staying to work the land they'd fought to reclaim. Each man came to say farewell, and Eliza was surprised by the emotion in their weathered faces. "You gave us hope, Senora," Jorge said, his wounded arm still in a sling. "Showed us that even bankers' gold can't buy everything." Carlos recovered enough to ride. pressed a small carved horse into her hands. For your children, when they come, so they know their mother was a warrior. As the sun climbed toward noon, Eliza and Raphael mounted their horses. Their possessions were few: bedrolls, provisions, her mother's photograph, and a modest purse from the sale of her jewelry. But Eliza felt richer than she'd ever been in Thomas's mansion. "Where to?" Raphael asked, though they'd already decided. "North," she said, smiling. "Colorado territory. I hear there's good land near the mountains, far from the desert and its memories." They rode out of Cedar Ridge for the last time, not looking back. The town would survive without Thomas, perhaps even thrive. The desert would endure as it always had, patient and eternal. And somewhere in the vast expanse of the American frontier, two people who'd found each other in the most unlikely way would build something new. As they paused at the top of the last hill, Eliza turned for one final look. The town seemed small from here, insignificant against the endless sweep of land and sky. She could see the Hartwell mansion, already bearing a "for sale" sign, the church where she'd married, the streets where she'd felt trapped. "Regrets?" Raphael asked, echoing his question from the cave. "None," she said, and meant it. "I chose the banker's gold once, thinking it meant security. But that wild night with a desert rider taught me that real gold can't be deposited in any bank. It lives in choices freely made and hearts freely given." He leaned over to kiss her, there on the hilltop with the whole world spread before them. When they parted, both were smiling. "Ready for whatever comes next?" he asked. "With you, always." They turned their horses north and rode into their future, leaving behind the woman who'd chosen safety and the man who'd chosen solitude. In their place rode partners, equals, lovers who'd been tested by fire and emerged stronger. The desert wind followed them for a while, as if reluctant to let them go. Then it turned back to its eternal dance among the rocks and sand, carrying their story to whoever had ears to hear it, a tale of choice and consequence, of love found in unexpected places, of freedom claimed at the highest price and counted cheap for what it bought. Somewhere in Colorado, they would build a small ranch. They would raise horses and children with equal care. They would grow old together, their love deepening like a river cutting through stone. And on quiet evenings, when the stars came out, Eliza would remember a cave, a fire, and the night that claimed her heart forever. But that's a story for another day. For now, they simply rode, two figures against the vast canvas of the frontier, writing their own destiny with every hoofbeat, every shared glance, every mile that took them further from who they'd been and closer to who they were meant to be. The banker's gold had bought a cage. The desert rider's love had opened its door. And Eliza Whitfield, free woman and her own master at last, had walked through it into a life worth living. In the distance, an eagle circled on the thermals, wild and free as the wind itself. Eliza watched it soar and smiled, understanding at last what it meant to fly. Thank you, dear listeners, for joining me on this wild journey through the untamed American frontier. I hope Eliza and Raphael's story touched your heart as it did mine. I'm curious, where in the world are you listening to this tale of love and freedom? Please share in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel for more stories of passion and courage from the Old West. What did you think of Eliza's transformation? Would you have chosen the banker's gold or the desert rider's love? Share your thoughts. I'd love to hear from you.